The rain was relentless that evening, hammering against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. I remember glancing at the clock on my dashboard, 7:43 p.m., as he slid into my passenger seat, bringing with him the scent of wet pavement and that cologne I could never quite identify. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, water dripping from his dark hair onto the collar of his jacket. I put the car in drive, pulling away from the curb, pretending that my heart wasn't racing, pretending that this was just another ride, just another evening. We were 3 blocks from his apartment when he did it, reached across the center console and gripped my hand. Not gently, not romantically, but with an urgency that made me nearly miss a stop sign. His fingers were cold, almost trembling, and in that moment, everything changed. I've given countless rides to friends, family, even strangers through those rideshare apps everyone uses now. But this ride was different. This wasn't just anyone in my passenger seat. This was Alex, my best friend of 15 years, the person who knew every embarrassing story from my childhood, every failed relationship, every dream I'd whispered into existence. And in all those years, he had never reached for my hand like this. The interior of my old Honda Civic had always felt spacious enough, but suddenly it seemed to shrink around us. The soft glow from the dashboard illuminated his profile, the sharp jawline, the slight furrow between his brows that appeared whenever he was troubled. Outside, the city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my heartbeat. There was something intimate about being enclosed in this small space together, isolated from the world by sheets of rain and the hum of the engine. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the rain and the windshield wipers that swept back and forth like a metronome counting the seconds of silence between us. His grip on my hand hadn't loosened. If anything, it had tightened, as though he was afraid I might pull away if given the chance. Let me explain why this moment matters so much. In friendships, especially long ones like ours, there are invisible boundaries that we establish over time, lines we don't cross, spaces we don't invade. The passenger seat of someone's car is already an intimate space, a place where conversations often flow more freely than they might face to face. There's something about staring ahead at the road that makes difficult truths easier to voice. And physical contact? That's another boundary altogether. Alex and I had hugged, had thrown arms around shoulders in photographs, had playfully shoved each other during arguments. But this deliberate reaching across the divide between us, this was new territory. I remember nodding, unable to form words, my eyes fixed on the road ahead as I navigated through the rain-slicked streets. The windshield wipers created a hypnotic rhythm, swish, 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 that seemed to match the pounding of my heart. I was acutely aware of every sensation, the slight dampness of his palm against mine, the warmth spreading between our connected skin, the way my steering wheel felt beneath my left hand. "You can tell me anything," I finally managed to say, attempting to keep my voice steady. "You know that." And it was true. Over 15 years, we had shared nearly everything, from the trivial to the traumatic. I'd held his hand at his mother's funeral 3 years ago, but that had been different. That had been expected, appropriate to the circumstance. This was something else entirely. The car ride had begun like any other. I'd picked him up from work, the architectural firm downtown where he'd recently been promoted, because his car was in the shop. We'd done this dozens of times before, falling into our usual pattern of conversation. Complaints about his demanding boss, updates on my graduate thesis, gossip about mutual friends, debates about which takeout place had the best spring rolls. The familiar dance of long-term friendship. But tonight, there had been a tension in the air from the moment he'd texted asking for a ride. His messages, usually peppered with those ridiculous emojis he loved so much, had been uncharacteristically brief. Just an address and a time. And when I'd pulled up to the curb, he'd been standing there in the rain without an umbrella, as if he hadn't even noticed the downpour. The passenger seat has always held a special significance in relationships. It's a place of trust, the passenger surrendering control to the driver, placing their safety literally in another's hands. It's also a place of vulnerability. In the passenger seat, you can't hide behind activities or distractions. You're simply present, facing forward, moving through the world together yet separate. Alex had occupied my passenger seat countless times over the years, but never with this electric tension between us. I've been offered a job in Seattle, he said finally, the words tumbling out all at once. It's a huge opportunity, the kind I've been working toward for years. They want me to head up their new sustainable design division. I felt a strange mix of emotions wash over me. Pride at his achievement, happiness for his success, but also a hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach. Seattle was over 2,000 miles away. Our daily coffee meetups, our weekend hikes, our impromptu movie nights, all of that would end. The grip of his hand on mine suddenly made sense. This wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a lifeline, a physical manifestation of his fear of losing our connection. That's amazing, I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. When would you start? I navigated through a particularly deep puddle, feeling the car hydroplane slightly before the tires found traction again. That's the thing, he said, his grip tightening even more. They need an answer by Monday. And if I say yes, I need to be there in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. 3 weeks to say goodbye to 15 years of friendship. 3 weeks to figure out what we meant to each other. 3 weeks to decide if what we had was worth fighting for. As we stopped at a red light, I finally turned to look at him directly. The rain created shadows that danced across his face, highlighting the uncertainty in his eyes. It struck me then how rarely we actually looked at each other anymore. Really looked, without the buffer of phones or television screens or other friends around us. When had we stopped seeing each other? What are you going to do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The light turned green, and I returned my attention to the road, but I could feel his eyes still on me, studying my profile as I had just studied his. I don't know, he admitted. It's everything I've worked for professionally. But, he trailed off, and I felt his thumb move slightly against the back of my hand, a small, perhaps unconscious gesture that sent a shiver up my arm. The atmosphere in the car had shifted. The comfortable silence we usually enjoyed had been replaced by something charged and uncertain. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the car like an impatient audience awaiting the next act of a play. I turned the wipers to their highest setting, but it barely helped. The world outside had become a watery blur, forcing us to focus inward, on each other, on the conversation we were dancing around. I remember thinking about all the car rides we'd shared before this one. The road trip to the coast during our senior year of college, when we talked about our dreams until the sun came up. The time we'd gotten hopelessly lost in the mountains and had to sleep in the car, waking up with stiff necks and the kind of laughter that makes your sides hurt. The silent drive home from his mother's funeral, when words seemed inadequate and simply being present was all I could offer. But what? I prompted, when it became clear he wasn't going to finish his thought. He sighed, a deep exhale that seemed to deflate him. But I can't imagine not seeing you every day. Not having coffee at that ridiculous hipster place you love so much. Not arguing about whether pineapple belongs on pizza. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. The traffic light ahead turned yellow, then red. I brought the car to a stop and turned to face him again. I can't imagine it either, I admitted. And it was true. Despite the occasional romantic relationships that had come and gone for both of us over the years, we had remained constants in each other's lives. There had been times when I'd wondered if there could be something more between us, but the fear of ruining what we had always held me back. Now, facing the prospect of losing him to distance, those unspoken questions seemed suddenly urgent. The grip of his hand on mine had become less desperate and more something else. Something I wasn't quite ready to name. His palm was warm now, his fingers interlaced with mine in a way that felt both new and somehow familiar, as if we'd been holding hands all our lives, but had only just noticed. As the light turned green and I accelerated, the car hydroplaned again, more severely this time. For a heart-stopping moment, we were gliding uncontrolled across the wet asphalt. Alex's hand tightened on mine reflexively, and my other hand gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Then the tires caught traction, and we were back in control, both breathing a little faster. Maybe slow down a bit, he suggested, his voice tight with the remnants of fear. I nodded, easing off the accelerator. Sorry about that. The near miss had heightened my senses even further. I was acutely aware of the rain's intensity, the limited visibility, and most of all, the warmth of his hand still firmly holding mine. It struck me as ironic. Here he was, asking me to slow down on the road, while simultaneously accelerating the pace of our relationship with his unexpected physical contact and emotional revelations. "Remember that time we got caught in that thunderstorm during the camping trip?" he asked suddenly, his voice lighter, as if trying to ease the tension. "And you were convinced we were going to be struck by lightning?" I laughed despite myself. "Because you insisted on standing under the tallest tree you could find. I was trying to save your life." "My hero," he said, and though I kept my eyes on the road, I could hear the smile in his voice. "You've always been that, you know, saving me from myself." The simple statement hit me with unexpected force. Had I been saving him all these years? Or had he been saving me? Perhaps we'd been saving each other in small ways neither of us fully recognized. As we approached his apartment building, I felt a strange reluctance to reach our destination. Once we arrived, this moment would end. He would remove his hand from mine, step out into the rain, and we'd return to our normal patterns. Except nothing felt normal anymore. The prospect of his move to Seattle hung between us, an unresolved chord in the soundtrack of our relationship. I pulled into a parking space near his building's entrance and turned off the engine. The sudden absence of the wipers made the rain seem even louder, a persistent drumming that filled the silence between us. Neither of us moved to leave the car. "Come up for a while?" he asked, his voice tentative. "I've got that fancy tea you like. We could talk more about everything." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. His hand finally slipped from mine as we both reached for our door handles, and I felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. The rain soaked us both in the short distance from the car to his building's entrance, but neither of us rushed. It was as if we were moving through a dream, where time had stretched and slowed around this pivotal moment in our lives. His apartment was exactly as I remembered it from my visit last week. Books stacked on every surface, architectural models in various stages of completion, that ridiculous cactus collection that somehow never died, despite his notorious inability to keep plants alive. But tonight, everything looked different somehow, as if I was seeing it through new eyes. Or perhaps it was that I was seeing us differently. The space we occupied in each other's lives, the patterns we'd established, the possibilities we'd never explored. He moved to the kitchen to put the kettle on, and I stood awkwardly in the middle of his living room, suddenly unsure of where to sit or what to do with my hands. We'd been in this exact scenario hundreds of times before, but the hand-holding in the car had altered something fundamental between us. I found myself watching him as he reached for mugs, noticing the way his still-damp shirt clung to his shoulders, the careful precision with which he measured the loose tea leaves. "So," he said, his back still to me, "Seattle." "Seattle," I echoed, sinking onto his couch. "It's a beautiful city. Have you been?" He turned to face me, leaning against the counter as the kettle began to heat. I shook my head. "No, but I've seen pictures. All that green, the water, the mountains." I trailed off, realizing I was rambling. "It would be good for you, I think. Your work has always had that Pacific Northwest aesthetic anyway." He smiled slightly. "That's what my boss said when he recommended me for the position." He hesitated, then added, "They have a good graduate program in marine biology there, at the University of Washington." My heart skipped a beat. Marine biology was my field, the focus of my doctoral research. Was he suggesting? "I looked it up," he continued, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "After I got the offer. Just out of curiosity." The kettle whistled, saving me from having to respond immediately. My mind was racing. Was he asking me to consider moving with him? Was that why he'd gripped my hand so tightly in the car, not out of fear of losing our friendship to distance, but as a prelude to suggesting we not be separated at all? He returned with 2 steaming mugs, setting mine on the coffee table before taking a seat beside me. Closer than usual, I noticed, our knees almost touching. The scent of jasmine rose from the tea, familiar and comforting amidst all this new uncertainty. "Alex," I began, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Are you asking me something?" He took a deep breath, then set his own mug down untouched. "I guess I am. Or I'm trying to. I'm not doing a very good job of it." He laughed nervously, running a hand through his still damp hair. "Here's the thing. When they offered me this job, my first thought wasn't about the salary or the prestige or even the work itself. My first thought was about you. About not seeing you every day. And it made me realize something I think I've known for a long time, but was too afraid to admit. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound around us. "What did you realize?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Instead of answering, he reached for my hand again, just as he had in the car. But this time, there was no desperation in his grip, only a gentle certainty. I realized that no job, no matter how perfect, would be worth it if it meant leaving you behind. And then I thought, what if I didn't have to choose? What if there was a way for both of us to have what we want? "Seattle," I said softly, beginning to understand. He nodded. "Seattle. Together. If you wanted to. If you could see yourself there, continuing your research at UW. If you could see yourself with me." The implications of what he was saying washed over me like a wave. This wasn't just about maintaining our friendship across distance. This was about transforming it into something else entirely. Something we'd danced around for years, perhaps, in those moments when our gazes held a beat too long, when our hugs lingered past the bounds of simple friendship. "When you grabbed my hand in the car," I said slowly, "I thought you were saying goodbye." His fingers tightened around mine. I was reaching out, literally and figuratively. I was terrified, to be honest. Still am. "If you don't feel the same way." I didn't let him finish. Years of unspoken feelings, of careful boundaries maintained, of wondering, what if, all converged in that moment. I leaned forward and kissed him, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as he responded immediately, his free hand coming up to cup my face with a tenderness that made my heart ache. When we finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, the rain had slowed to a gentle patter against the windows. The storm was passing, both outside and within us. In its place was a clarity I hadn't expected to find when I'd picked him up just an hour earlier. "So," he said, his forehead resting against mine, "Seattle?" I smiled, feeling a sense of certainty I'd rarely experienced before. "Seattle," I agreed. Together. The grip of his hand in mine had changed everything. What had begun as a gesture of desperation had become a bridge to a future neither of us had dared to imagine explicitly, but had perhaps been moving toward all along. As we sat there, planning our new life in a city neither of us had visited, I thought about how often the most significant moments come disguised as ordinary ones. A rainy evening, a car ride, a hand reaching across the center console, holding on tight. Sometimes, it's in the passenger seat of life that we find our true direction. And sometimes, it takes the prospect of separation to reveal what's been right beside us all along. Total_char_count, 14,108.